After we discuss about the entity, as well as the basic constraints regarding to the relationships, it is time for us to see how do we convert those company requirements into a full ER diagram. So in our entity part, we looked into the database requirements regarding to the department, project, employee, and dependent. We draw 4 entities out of it. Department is described by the name, number, manager, and manager start date. It can locate in multiple locations. Project, it has the name, number, location, controlling department. Obviously, by looking into just these 2 entities, you understand the controlling department is actually a relationship between the project and the department. It's the same thing that department has a manager. However, a manager is also an employee. So it's actually this attribute will become a relationship that connects the 2 entities together. And therefore, the relationships are actually the attributes that we draw in the entity requirement discussion. Employee is the same thing. It has the name, remember the composite attributes, social security number, gender, salary, work zone. This is talking about a project. So this is actually going to be converted into a relationship. Supervisor itself is also employee. So how do we describe that? Address, birthday, department which they works for, that again, this attribute will become a relationship that connects the employee and the department. Finally, dependent. Dependent has their dependent name, employee, sex, birthday, relationship. So the employee is actually talking about who does this dependent depends on. And therefore, you can see that in this slide, we talked about how do we really convert the attributes into the relationships so that we can have a full ER diagram looks like this. I underline 4 attributes on the left side, indicating that these are the 4 basic relationships that we already have learned, and let's see how do we convert those. Starting with the department from the manager attribute, this we know is actually a relationship that connects the department as well as the employee. So in our employee, we actually connect with each other with a relationship goes to the department. Based on our descriptions, we understand that not every employee, so we use a single line, controls 1 department. However, every department control has to be managed by 1 employee. So we have a double line here and a single line here. You may notice that this is an interesting part. The start date, which describes who is the manager start date that comes from this attribute, goes with the relationship. This can be further understood by when we were talking about the department, we described that manager and manager start date is better to be combined together as a composite attribute coming from a manager information. If we don't do this that way, it's totally fine, but you would need to understand manager start date comes with the manager. So it's actually an attribute describing this relationship. And yes, relationship can have attributes as well. You will see that in the works on part. Now, if we look into the project, you have a controlling department indicating that which department controls the project. That converts in here. And you can notice that once we convert that, the project does not have that attribute anymore because that attribute has been evaluated into a relationship. So you can see the project now has only name, number, location. Both 2 of the items are underlined, indicating this. Both of them can be a good candidate key. When we try to connect department as well as the project through a relationship, it is time for us to think about those constraints. So you can see that in this design, department maybe controls several projects here. This implies that not every department need to have project. Of course, if you don't think that's the case or the reality is not the case, you put double lines over this relationship that would say every department needs to have some projects. So it depends on how big is your department. Basically, if your company has like 10 departments and some of the departments are like financial department or something that controls, or even human resources, they don't really control the research projects, that would be the case here. Of course, if the company has only like 3 departments, each department has some important projects, then we probably need to put double lines over there. On the other side, based on the requirements, department controls the project, so that every project need to have a department to control them. That's why we have a double line here, say every project need to participate in this relationship, and there's one department controls the project. So you can see that we converted the 2 relationships here. If we look into the employee, there are 2 attributes that we put underline. Let's take a look at the easier one, department, indicating that every employee has a department that they works for. So we put a double line indicating every employee must specify one department that they are working for. On the other side, every department must have several employees who works for them. And that's why we have to have the double line over here. Finally, works on, which talks about what projects they're working on and how many hours they've been spending on that project. So we look into this one, understand this is actually a complex attribute. So we form the project into a relationship with the employee, so they will work on the projects. We discussed about this one. This is going to be an M-to-N relationship because every employee can work on several projects. Each project can work by multiple employees. Interesting thing, just similar to the composite attribute concepts that we discussed about the manager and manager start date, because these hours will go with the relationship between the employee and project. So if employee works on 3 projects, that needs to have 3 hours describing each project they've been working on. And therefore, it is the best way to describing the attributes on this relationship. So in this ER diagram, we have actually looked into the majority of the ER diagrams already. If you understand this, we actually look into the whole parts on this right-hand side of all the informations already. Of course, we have 2 more special relationships that we need to dig into. Let's take a look at that. Recursive relationship, indicating that it is a relationship that involving the same entity. So in some cases, the same entity type participate more than once in a relationship type in different roles. So think about this. In our supervisor, every employee has a supervisor, or every employee have some supervisors to describe them. In this case, a supervisor is also an employee. So that forms a recursive relationship here. This is an interesting descriptions that we can see. On top of it, we talked about the schema. Remember, employee and supervision has a relationship with the employee itself. Originally, when we're talking about a schema, we have an entity, relationship, another entity. But because the entity is themselves, so we actually try to understand this. This is an employee has a supervision relationship with the employee. How do we describe that in the instances? We actually using like 1 and 2 to talk about what is the directions of that. And basically, 1 is saying that who is that person supervised by the other side of it. So if you looked into this picture, there's one thing that you may be able to distinguish is that when we look into the structure or the hierarchy in this picture, you will see employee 1 is actually supervising employee 2 and employee 3. So you can see that employee 1 goes to employee 2 over here. Employee 1 goes to employee number 3 over here. And the same thing, employee 4 is supervising 6 and 7. And if you understand it correctly, employee 5 is actually the boss. And one more interesting thing is this. There is no one supervising employee number 5. That's some details we want to discuss in the representation of the recursive relationship. So let's take a look at this one. Employee has an attribute called supervisor. So in this description, because of this attribute, we will need to convert this attribute into a recursive relationship here. So to note this relationship correctly in every single detailed way, take a look of this representation. Employee has a recursive relationship called supervision. So employee is a supervisor of multiple supervisee over here. Since not every employee is a supervisor, so this is a single line over here. If we look into the other direction, employee has one supervisor, goes back over here. Think about this. Why did I put a single line over here? That indicates some employee does not have a supervisor. So if you go back to the previous slide, you understand because we have an employee number 5 that does not have any supervisor. That's why we put a single line over here. Of course, if we want to put a double line to represent a more complete idea, saying that everyone needs to have their supervisor, that would end up employee number 5 will supervise employee number 5 himself. If we make that choice, then we can put a double line on this side of the recursive relationship. Finally, we have only one thing left. And of course, this one looks totally different from all other relationships because this one has a double diamond and a double rectangular, talking about a dependent. So what does that mean? Let's take a look at this. Weak entity type. This represents the idea of the weak entity. Consider entity type of dependent related to the employee. They are only relevant to the company because of the dependent. Okay? They are identified as distinct entities only after determining the particular employee entity to which dependent is related. Think about this. If this employee get fired, then their dependent does not relevant to the company anymore. That is the important idea of the weak entity. So weak entity type normally has a partial key, which is the set of attributes that can uniquely identify weak entities that we are related to the same owner entity, such as children number 1, children number 2, children number 3, that's connected to the employee they are looking at. That is a very special concept of the weak entity here. In ER diagram, both weak entity type and its identifying relationships are distinguished by surrounding their box and diamonds with double lines. The partial key attribute is underlined as a dashed line. So you can see that in the figure, because dependent has to depending on an entity here. So we double rectangular or double box the dependent attribute, indicating that this is a weak entity. The key to a weak entity is under dash line. So if you draw a double box over here, their key will have a dash line underline of their key attribute, which is what we call their partial key. Besides, weak entity may have multiple relationships, but we have to identify that this, since I say this is a weak entity, which one is their identifying entity? So we use only one double diamond indicating that dependent belongs to the employee. So think about this. If I have an insurance agency entity over here, it will have another relationship with the dependent. It will also have the relationship with employee. But that diamond will be regular diamond. You will only have one double diamond for the weak entity, indicating that which one they belongs to. Again, this is a very important concept because when you are looking at the dependent, they only exist because of the employee. So if we fire the employee, the dependent in the database no longer important to our database. If we looked into that concept, thinking about this, if I fire someone, the department they are associated with is still there. The same thing about the project. If we fire someone or someone left the job, the project is still existing in the database. We are not going to kill the project because the person are left. So this is a very important concept to understand the difference between the weak entity as well as the regular entities. Some other real life example you can think about. If we're looking at some athletes information using NBA, National Basketball Association as an example, the players' statistics. Thinking every player have some interesting statistics. What's their field goal rate? What's their average number of rebounds? So those are the things associated with the player. If the player no longer plays in NBA, those information are not going to be important anymore. Using another example, if we look into the movie as our mini world domain, each, say, director, they can win some awards, global award, Oscar award. So those award history associate with the directors himself only. If the director is no longer keep tracked in our database, then those information are not important anymore. So you can see this is the kind of ideas. It's not a very easy concept over here, but that gives you the ideas that what does it feel like a weak entity. If something no longer there, then this item is not relevant anymore. We will see some practices in the future as well. Another way to understand the weak entity type is that it can be converted into complex attributes. Think about this. If we come back to this one, saying that we don't want to use the weak entity anymore, I want to merge that back into the employee. You can totally convert that into a complex attribute called dependent, and with all of those attributes attached, forming a composite attribute. So they can have multiple dependents. That's why it's a multi-value attribute, as well as a composite attribute that forms a complex attribute. So if that something can be formed into a complex attribute, then that can be considered as a weak entity. In the example, we can specify the multi-value attribute depends for the employee, which is composite attribute with component attributes of name, birthday, sex, and relationship. The choice is designer's choice. Like we said, the design is always a black art, so that how do you want to choose is going to be an important thing. I can provide a general guideline if a weak entity has some other relationships. It is better to let it stay as is. If like what we have over here, the dependent stands on its own, there's no other relationship connects anything, it can be a complex attribute without too much trouble. So that is like a general concepts over here. To sum up all the things that we have discussed in the ER diagram, we looked into a rectangular box specified as an entity. If we put a double box, indicates it's a weak entity. Diamond shape indicates its relationship. Double diamond specify the identifying relationship. Regular attribute, this can be a single attribute, simple attribute as well. Attribute underline indicates it's a key attribute. Double oval says that multi-value attribute. Composite attribute is the attributes on top of the attribute. Of course, if you combine the two things together, it forms a complex attribute. If they are under dash line, it's specified as the derived attribute. Talking about dash line, if we have an under dash line, that means it's a partial key. Relationships specify in two different things. One is about the total and partial constraint. The other one is about the cardinal ratio. So this sums up all the things that we have discussed in the ER diagram. So let's do a practice. Thinking about this one as your assignment of the day, I want you to design an ER schema for this application and draw the ER diagram for the schema. So basically, I want you to draw an ER diagram, submit that via Blackboard. So consider the following set of requirements for car dealer database design. So now our mini world application is about a car dealer. There's only two descriptions indicating there are two tables, two entities you need to work on. The first one, the database represents each vehicle, keeping their unique VIN number, make, year, model, color, etc., horsepower, and the price. So we have a vehicle entity. Each car dealer branch has a unique number, name, single location, vehicle owned. So we have a vehicle entity over here, and we have a vehicle owned here. So how do we describe that? It's going to be interesting. Thinking about that. And open hours from Monday through Saturday. So of course, this is a very simple or a small ER diagram for you to warm up. So I want you guys to work on this one, draw the ER diagram, and submit this as an assignment through the Blackboard.